You're here to be eaten. Think you can take me? Bring it! Round one, unleash! This'll be the mark!
This is a big fall season for publisher Outright Games. One of their latest releases, Zoids Wild Blast Unleashed, is out now on Nintendo Switch as an exclusive title. Does this 3D arena fighting game pay homage to the current anime series and fighting games alike? Let's take a look and find out. Zoids Wild Blast Unleashed is based on the 5th anime series of the franchise and is the international release of the Japan-exclusive Zoids Wild King of Blast, originally released in early 2019. The international version comes packaged with all the DLC released for King of Blast, so it's fair to say Blast Unleashed is considered the definitive version of the game. At its core, Zoids Wild Blast Unleashed is an arena-style 3D fighting game and, like the anime, takes place in a world where humans ride atop giant mechs, dubbed Zoids, that serve as their partners. Like many fighting games, it comes with the standard fighting game trappings: health bars, special meters, light and heavy attacks, special moves, and sort of ultra Final Smash type moves. Frankly, it seems to take a ton of cues from Pokken Tournament in that regard. Despite being based on an IP which has relied mainly on physical children's toys and cartoons, Blast Unleashed holds surprising depth mechanically. I highly recommend players play through the entirety of the game's tutorial, because jumping straight into battle, all of its mechanics and how certain moves or combos work aren't immediately apparent. I played a few rounds of 2-player battle mode with my 11-year-old son, who apparently doesn't have time to sit through a tutorial, and it took him several rounds along with me explaining how to use wild actions, the game's name for special moves, how to engage Wild Blast, and how to activate his final blast before he started routinely beating me. That probably tells me I should have kept those secrets under wraps. That said, the depth of combat is made apparent once you run through the tutorial. You have your standard light, heavy, and dash attacks, though these can't be mixed and matched, meaning you can only execute a light attack combo or a heavy attack combo, so these combos tend to feel a little button mashy. That said, in addition to having light, heavy, and dash attacks at your disposal, holding the R button and pressing the Y, X, or A buttons use rechargeable special moves which are unique to each Zoid. All offer reasonable power, but some are more useful than others in my experience. For example, one of my favorite Zoids, Tanks, relies on heavy artillery for its wild actions. One such action, Analog Blitz, effectively shoots a rocket across the arena at the enemy and ostensibly has the longest reach of any move in the game. Mega Drop, another of Tanks' wild actions, shoots a mortar into the air and drops it onto your opponent wherever they might be, though it is avoidable. Tanks' third wild action, Atomic Shell, holds Tanks in place while it turns its shell into a bomb which explodes upon enemy contact. These wild actions far outshine those of other Zoids which are glorified light or heavy attacks, such as Liger, but each Zoid's wild actions hold merit by either being powerful or tactical. It's up to trial and error to determine which Zoid's moves mesh well with your playstyle, which is a great way to entice players to try out every Zoid to find their favorite. And that's just wild actions. There's also blocking, and there are moves that you can use from a blocking stance to outwit your opponent, like moves where your Zoid can sort of sidestep and strike the opponent from behind. Then, there are Wild Blasts and Final Blasts. First, let's cover Wild Blasts. The name Wild Blast applies to any of the Zoids on Team Freedom, effectively the good guys in the anime. And for the members of the Dark Warriors, the bad guys, Wild Blast is known as Dark Blast. The two aren't only different in name, however, they actually have different functional mechanics. For Wild Blasts, you have to land attacks on your opponent to fill the blast gauge, at which point you can press the L and R buttons together to initiate a Wild Blast. For Dark Blasts, the blast gauge is filled when the battle starts and you can use Dark Blast immediately, but at the cost of losing a little HP over time for the duration of the Dark Blast. The game never explains how this works or why Wild Blasts and Dark Blasts function so differently, which is definitely a miss. The good news on Dark Blasts is that the HP loss function will never kill your Zoid. It'll always leave at least 1 HP, so you don't have to worry about unintentionally causing your own demise in that regard. Functionally, Wild Blasts and Dark Blasts power up Zoid's wild actions, but they also enable Zoids to use their Final Blast, which is a sort of Smash Bros. Final Smash move. If successful, the move triggers, for most Zoids, a momentary cutscene and displays some cool looking moves which typically cause a ton of damage. Like in Pokken Tournament, however, these moves can be easily blocked, and even if you aren't blocking when the Final Blast animation begins, you can press the block button while the initial animation runs, and you might be lucky enough to be blocking by the time the move hits. On one hand, it is a little frustrating with how often both you and your opponent are able to use Final Blasts, once per round, but the fact that they're easily blocked somewhat makes up for this. Overall, the combat in Blast Unleashed sees a substantial amount of depth when considering this is a kid's license. It's no Street Fighter or Tekken to be sure, but it can hold its own. Outside of battle mode, which supports 1 to 2 players locally, Blast Unleashed gives players plenty of options on how to play. On our missions, players are able to play continuous battle, which is essentially arcade mode, as well as story mode and practice mode. Story mode is the highlight of the game's modes because of how it's designed. Players start out with the main protagonist from Zoids Wild, Arashi, and his partner, Liger. After 2 battles using Arashi and Liger, story mode starts to branch off into other characters in Zoids. You can continue across Arashi's horizontal path to continue his story thread, or you can take any of the divergent vertical paths to experience story threads from other playable characters in Zoids, and each human and Zoid combo from the character select screen has their own story beat. For me personally, the stories told in these threads weren't particularly engaging, but fans of the show should pick up on some of the references and character interactions. That said, the presentation of the story mode and its pathing system is the most compelling reason to at least give story mode a shot. It's a shame that none of the written dialogue is accompanied by voice acting, but some of the characters do have voiced exclamations or phrases from time to time, which is a nice touch short of a full voiceover. Sadly, that's it for game modes. No online play is currently available, and Outright Games tells me there are currently no plans for implementing online play in the future, nor are there plans for any future DLC. Which makes sense, considering this is the international release which contains all of the base game content plus DLC from the original Japanese release. The lack of online play is a shame, considering Blast Unleashed feels so well suited for it, but I can't even speculate on the costs of hosting online servers like that. Graphically, Blast Unleashed looks great and its image is sharp, but there is a noticeable drop in quality when playing in handheld mode. Per the publisher, the game technically runs at 1080p docked and at 720p handheld, but jagged edges are far more prominent in handheld mode. It's generally not an issue when Zoids are in motion, but studying still character models makes the flaw far more noticeable. It's not a huge issue if using the standard Switch and TV mode is an option, but for Switch Lite users this may be a tipping point in the wrong direction. Despite the lack of an online play option and somewhat disappointing visuals in handheld mode, Zoids Wild Blast Unleashed is a more than competent 3D arena fighting game that doesn't require knowledge of the source material to bring in new players. A simple yet deep control system, a diverse variety of Zoids to choose from, and a surprisingly well-presented story mode all coalesce into a great Switch exclusive experience. If you're a fighting game fan, and even if you aren't a Zoids fan, you owe it to yourself to add this title to your collection. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this review, please like and subscribe to support us. Until next time, it's been a pleasure.
You and me, no one can beat us. Okay. Player 1 win. That was something.